St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. The pages of history books are filled with civilizations that once ruled the world. For example, the ancient Egyptian empire that ruled around 3,000 years before Jesus Christ. Here's a picture of ancient Egypt at that time and how far their empire reached, marked by the areas in kind of the mustard yellow. And one of the reasons for their success was their geographical location, and for 3,000 years, they were one of the most enduring and successful civilizations in human history. It seemed as if this empire would last forever, but with foreign invasions and internal division, their empire fell into decline. Then came the Assyrian Empire. Here's the picture of that empire marked by the two areas in green. They were one of the most feared military powers of the ancient world, which was one of the reasons for their empire's success. The other was their organization. For nearly 300 years, they dominated the ancient Near East, but with overexpansion, internal rebellion, and foreign enemies, their empire also fell into decline. After the Assyrian Empire came the Babylonian Empire, famous for its wealth and power as well as its beautiful cities. This is a map of their empire and how far it reached, the area marked in green. And one of the reasons for their success was their economic wealth as well as their military strength too. For nearly a century, they were the dominant power in the ancient world, but eventually another empire rose up and conquered Babylonia, and their empire disappeared. Then came the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had yet to see. Here's a map of the Persian Empire and just how far their borders reached. Some of the reasons for their success was their ability to govern different peoples, and for over 200 years they ruled from India all the way to Africa, but eventually internal weakness, and the rise of Alexander the Great brought their empire to an end. Last but not least was the Roman Empire, perhaps the greatest of the ancient world. This is a map of their empire and just how far stretching their boundaries reached. The Roman Empire rose for several reasons: their military strength, their system of government, as well as their engineering. And for nearly 500 years, it seemed like Rome was unstoppable. But with political instability as well as economic troubles and foreign invasions, the empire gradually collapsed. I know what some of you are thinking here this morning. Pastor, I came to church to hear a sermon, not get a lecture on world civilizations. Don't worry, folks, there won't be a quiz after this, but if there is something that the history books can teach us, it is this: great empires can rise, but they also can fall. The Egyptian Empire lasted roughly 3,000 years. The Assyrian Empire, nearly 300 years. The Babylonian Empire, about 100 years. The Persian Empire, around 200 years. And the Roman Empire, about 500 years. Now, these weren't necessarily the longest lasting civilizations in human history, but I thought it might be helpful to place a few of those side by side, especially as our own nation celebrates its 250th anniversary this weekend. Because when you see those numbers, it gives you a little perspective. On one hand, America is still relatively young compared to some older civilizations, while on the other hand, we've already outlasted quite a few. And perhaps on our 250th anniversary, this is a good time to pause and ask ourselves, what causes nations to rise? And what causes them to fall? What makes a people endure? And what makes them give up? And in the midst of all that, where is God in the midst of history? Well, those weren't abstract questions for our main character for this morning. Her name was Esther, who lived during the height of the Persian Empire we just mentioned. And at the time of our passage, her people were facing the possibility of I can't even say the word now, it's right there. Annihilation. I could hear it in my head now that I see it. They were on the brink of being erased from history. Our passage for this morning comes from the middle of Esther's story, Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. Esther, along with her people, were living as exiled servants under the king of Persia by the name of Xerxes, when an evil official named Haman had convinced the king to issue a decree ordering the destruction of all the Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire. When Esther's cousin Mordecai heard of the plot, he challenged Esther to use her position as the queen to help save her people, even though that might cost her life. Our passage for this morning records the conversation between Esther and Mordecai. I'll be reading from the NIV translation. It's in the Pew Bible, page 535. It's rather lengthy, so maybe just follow along on screen. Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. Let's prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's word. Mordecai persuades Esther to help. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa to show to Esther and to explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the royal scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days has passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. This is the word of the Lord. The story of Esther took place around 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, during the height of the Persian Empire. It occurred during a time commonly referred to as the post-exilic period, which was the time after the destruction of Jerusalem, and many of God's people were taken into exile. There are 3 Old Testament books that recorded the events of this time frame: the book of Esther, the book of Ezra, as well as the book of Nehemiah. The latter 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah, primarily focused on those who returned back to Jerusalem. The book of Esther, however, focused on those who remained in the Persian Empire. In other words, Esther is the story of God's people who lived as a minority community in a foreign land, who tried to remain faithful while being far away from home. Now, the book of Esther is only 10 chapters, long or short. It's only 10 chapters, and it's quite an interesting read. If you thought in just the reading of those 17 verses it was very intriguing, wait till you read the entire book. It's definitely a book in the Bible you can read probably in 20 minutes or less, and it has all the elements of a great story. There's palace intrigue, as well as sleepless kings. There's assassination plots, as well as political maneuvering. There are secret identities as well as role reversals. There's even a beauty contest. The book of Esther reads like a modern political thriller, and you'll be done before you even know it. But for those of you who prefer the Cliff Notes, here's what the story's about. Esther was a young Jewish woman, part of a minority group of people who lived far away from home during the Persian Empire. Her story actually gets started when the current queen, Queen Vashti, fell out of favor with King Xerxes, so a royal beauty contest was held to find the next king, and after a 4-year search, Esther was finally chosen. But even as the new king, she had to keep her Jewish identity under wraps, a big secret. Meanwhile, there was this royal official named Haman who rose to power in the Persian courts, and when Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refused to bow down to Haman, that's when Haman plotted to have all the Jews killed. Mordecai found out about this plot, which prompted him to reach out to his cousin Esther, but even as the queen, she was only able to do so much without revealing her own ethnicity and risking her own life. Mordecai, though, pleaded with Esther, which was explained in our passage, and that's when he wrote that famous line, "Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" So poetic. Moved by the request, Esther then asked all her people to fast with her and risked her own life by approaching the king uninvited and exposed Haman's plot, which resulted in all her people being saved. I hope I didn't ruin the story for you, but that's the summary of the book of Esther. For those of you who are going to read it, I encourage you to do so. But let me share a few fun facts that you might not have known about Esther. Fun fact number 1. Esther is only one of 2 books in the Bible that are named after women. The other book is Ruth. It's interesting that Ruth was a Gentile living among God's people, while Esther was a Jew living among Gentiles. Kind of a fun little mirror story that you can now remember forever. Fun fact number 2. Esther is also one of only 2 books in the Bible that is not directly quoted in any other book in the Bible. The other is the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. Meaning, you're not going to find any quotes or a single reference to Esther in any of the history books, in any of the Psalms, in any of the prophetic writings, in any of the Gospels, any of the epistles, or any other book in the Bible. It's interesting. It's almost a standalone book. Fun fact number 3, and this is where things really get interesting this morning. Nowhere in the book of Esther, in any of the 10 chapters, is there any mention of God. In fact, God, or any variation of God's name, Yahweh or Adonai, even the title Lord, does not appear even once. And not only that, in none of the 10 chapters do we see anyone praying to God or singing a hymn or see anyone going to a temple to offer up a sacrifice to God. So, that begs the question this morning, why is this story even in the Bible? Excellent question. For a book that doesn't mention God's name or include any prayers, for a story that no one else wants to quote, for a woman who wasn't a judge or a prophet and didn't come from fame, why is her story in the Bible? Do I have your attention now? Well, for starters, the book of Esther preserved the story of what almost happened to God's people, but it also shows that even in a story where God isn't mentioned at all, God still had a very big part of it. The book of Esther is not a story of a group of people who forgot about God, but a story about God who never forgot his people. And even though on the surface it might seem like God was absent, quietly and under the surface, God was working all along. What I appreciate about the book of Esther is that God often works behind the scenes. That's my first point for this morning. God often works behind the scenes. It might not look like it, might not even sound like it, but all along in the story of Esther, God was right there. You know how there are those people in the Bible where it's obvious that God has a hand in their lives? For example, consider the story of David. Even before David was anointed as the king, even before he became the king, God was very present in his life. And unlike Esther, David always talked about God. Just go through some of the Psalms that he wrote. The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord is my rock. The Lord is my salvation. It was as if the name of the Lord was always on David's lips. David wrote songs or psalms about God. He publicly worshiped God. He built altars in God's honor. He even tried to build a temple too. Throughout David's life, you see him praying to God, talking to God. It was as if David wore his faith on his sleeve and God was an everyday presence. Then there are some people in the Bible where it's a little less obvious that God had a hand in their lives. For example, consider the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph's story is kind of like Esther, in the sense that Joseph lived far away from home and grew up among foreigners. And for most of Joseph's life, we don't really hear him talk much about God or mention God at all. And unlike David, Joseph didn't pray much at all. He didn't build any altars or monuments to God's name, but finally, near the end of Joseph's story, he gives us one of the Bible's greatest quotes when he said to his brothers that famous line, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Now all of a sudden we realize that Joseph understood that God was working in his life ever since the beginning. But then we come to Esther's story, which was very different than Joseph's or David's. Esther never sang any psalms like David. She never lifted up any prayers, or at least none in public. She wasn't showy. She wasn't performative. She didn't do things for others to see. In fact, if she did worship, she kept that worship life very private. And unlike Joseph, who finally gave credit to God looking back on his entire life, Esther did no such thing. But credit, or no credit. What the story of Esther teaches us is that God often works behind the scenes, shaping and directing our lives towards the path that God wants for us. God was working when Esther became the queen. God was working when Mordecai overheard the assassination plot. God was working when the king couldn't sleep. And God was working when Esther found the courage to finally act. This is the truth we discover in Esther's story, and maybe in our own lives too, that God often works behind the scenes, under the surface, and even sometimes outside the spotlight, whether we know it or not, and whether we say it or not. Maybe you know some people who can't quote their favorite Bible verse, but their lives sure read like good news. Maybe you know some people who don't know all the lyrics to some of our favorite hymns, but the way they live their lives sure sings a gospel tune. Maybe you know someone who doesn't wear their faith on their sleeve or doesn't invoke God's name in every other sentence, but somehow grace and mercy, kindness and love have become their living vocabulary. Maybe you know people like that. Maybe that person is even you. Maybe your life right now might not feel particularly spiritual. Maybe your days are filled with paying bills or doctor's appointments. Maybe you're busy caring for family or just coming to church, and you're busy running errands, simply trying to be faithful. And maybe there are times in your own life where you are wondering, is God doing anything in my life at all? And this is where Esther would say, more than you can imagine. What the story of Esther shows us is that you don't have to be loud to be faithful. You don't have to be flashy to be spiritual. And you don't have to advertise your faith for God to be working in your life. Anyone want to say amen? Now there's a great quote in our passage that I want to close with. It's the quote from Mordecai and what he said to Esther in verse 12 through 14. Hear the whole quote and then focus on the one part. I think we have it, yeah. He says, do not think, this is to Esther, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? That's the part of the quote that you often hear people say. It's the last part that says, for such a time as this. You want to say that with me? For such a time as this. What a great line. No wonder why people are quoting it to this day. For such a time as this, meaning for this particular moment, for this exact moment in time, for this rare occasion. There's a famous painting by the artist John Trumbull that captured the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is a picture of it. It's small on the screen, but the original dimensions is 12 feet high by 18 feet long, painted back in 1819. I think you have to agree with me that this painting captured more than a historical event. It captured a moment when everyone in that room knew that history was being made, or as Mordecai might have said, for such a time as this. Here we are this weekend celebrating the 250th anniversary of that moment when these 56 individuals signed their names on that document, declaring our independence and putting their lives at risk. Fun fact, full of fun facts this morning. Did you know that among these 56 individuals, one of them was a Presbyterian? Anyone want to guess who that is? Where he is standing or sitting in the picture? I'll give you a hint. In the next picture, this is him underneath that big arrow. Does that help any? And then this next picture, it's a zoomed in picture of him. He's sitting down way obscure in the back. His name was John Witherspoon, representative of New Jersey. He was the sole Presbyterian minister and theologian who also was the president of Princeton University. Can you go back up just 2 pictures? This is good too. This was our nation's, for such a time as this, moment, when these individuals risked their lives, just like Esther, in order to save a people. Going back to Esther. But Mordecai wasn't asking Esther, let me rephrase that, but Mordecai was asking Esther to do more than sign a piece of paper. He was asking her to go and plead before the king, explaining to her that this was her moment to fight for freedom and the salvation of her people. For such a time as this. For most of us, for such a time as this moment is not as dramatic. Most of us will never be asked to save an entire nation or sign a Declaration of Independence. Most of us will never stand before kings or people in powerful positions. But all of us, at one point in our lives, may face moments when we must decide to speak out or remain silent, to step forward and up or to step back. Maybe for such a time as this moment might look like making a phone call. Maybe for such a time as this moment might look like offering forgiveness. Maybe it might look like speaking a word of truth or standing up against injustice. Maybe for such a time as this moment, is caring for an aging spouse or parent, or showing courage in face of illness. Or maybe for such a time as this moment, is to remain faithful when everyone else has given up. The truth is, most of us, we don't recognize those for such a time as this moments when we are actually living them. We only recognize them years later when we look back and realize that was one of those moments. That conversation that you finally had. That decision you finally made. That season of faithfulness during a difficult time, and perhaps that's because God often prepares us quietly long before he calls us to act. Esther didn't know how her story would end. Neither did John Witherspoon. In the same way, that's also true for us. God can take an ordinary person and place them in ordinary circumstances, and then at the right moment, inspire them to respond in faith. And who knows? Perhaps God has brought each of us to this place, to this church, to this family, in this season of life, for such a time as this. And all God's people said,